Welcome in everybody to another edition of my roster review series with a look into the 2022 Toronto Argonauts, a team that is coming off a very strong season last year and is looking to take the next step. But really quickly before we get going with today's video, if you want to support the channel, as always, be sure to drop a like down below. Just takes 2 seconds, guys, and it makes a huge difference to help me reach more people with these videos on YouTube. And with that said, let's talk about today's agenda. First of all, we're going to be talking about their 2021 recap, what happened with the Argos last season. Then we're going to be talking about their 2022 coaching staff that they're going to be bringing in to this season. Then we're going to be talking about their 2022 positional rankings, where every position on this team stacks up relative to the rest of the CFL. And then we'll piece together the starting lineups on offense and defense. And then finally, we'll wrap up with the team award predictions and a key storyline to look out for this team this year. And with that said, let's talk about their 2021 season. And it was a great season, all things considered, for the Argos. They missed the playoffs in 2019, and obviously the canceled 2020 season. So it was a couple years without playoffs there for the Argos, and they were able to have one of their best regular seasons, I believe, since 2000. So really impressive from the Argos from a record standpoint. They went 6-1 at home, and their one loss was, I think, that meaningless game against Edmonton the last week or so of the season. So really impressive. Finished first in the East Division standings. And ultimately, they fall short of their ultimate goal, losing in the East Final to Hamilton. Ultimately, disappointing result by the end of the season for the Argos last year, but ultimately, I think it was a positive development for this franchise, and it has to be viewed as a positive step forward. They're just one of those teams that's looking to take the next step here, and we'll see if they can get that done this season. And speaking of which, let's talk about their 2022 coaching staff, led by head coach Ryan Dinwiddie, former quarterback in the CFL. Relatively young head coach. It was his first season as a head coach last year, and I think he did a pretty good job, especially having both the offensive coordinator role and the head coach role. I think he did a relatively good job throughout the season. Maybe some of the in-game adjustments could be better to help generate more offense, but I think some of the game plans he came into the year with, the game that they beat Winnipeg pretty soundly, that was a very impressive offensive game plan. One of the most impressive game plans I saw all of last season. And then he also brings in defensive coordinator Corey Mace, who's another recent player in the CFL, former defensive lineman. He is a younger coordinator that is going to be joining this staff. And then finally, special teams coordinator Mickey Donovan. So I think it's a relatively young staff considering Mace and Dinwiddie, but I think that Dinwiddie showed a lot of promise in his first year as a head coach, and we'll see if he can keep that going this season. Now flipping over to the positional rankings with the quarterback position, which is going to come in at 7th in the CFL. And McLeod Bethel-Thompson, it's just, I'm not ready to pull the trigger on saying he's a number one guy for a CFL team. I've just seen too many stretches of inconsistency, but I do like a lot about him. He's a pocket passer that has perhaps the strongest arm in the CFL today and can physically make all the throws. However, Bethel-Thompson is a very bipolar player, capable of some of the hottest stretches we've seen from quarterbacks in the CFL the past 2 seasons, but also some of the worst quarterback play the league has had to offer the past couple of years. What's a really concerning trend for me from 2021 was that he really started off very well to the season, but then towards the middle of the season, when he became the undisputed starter for this team, he really struggled down the stretch, and this was really highlighted in the East Final against Hamilton when they couldn't reach the end zone. So Bethel-Thompson didn't finish the season very well, and that's very concerning. Last season, I think Toronto's playmakers really were the big difference with him, because he couldn't hit anything deep down the field last year for whatever reason. It just was absent from his game despite his great arm and the fact that he was a good deep ball passer in 2019. I think that part of his game could return this year, but we need to see the consistency, and that's what I'm looking for from him this year. And then Antonio Pipkin, who's a very athletic quarterback that is still very raw as a passer. And then moving on to the 2 rookies here, Chad Kelly, a former NFL draft pick, last pick in the NFL draft the year he came out, and he was a star at Ole Miss. Most notably, he is the nephew of Jim Kelly, former Hall of Fame Buffalo Bills quarterback, so that's notable there. And then Austin Simmons, who's a former standout at South Dakota, a school that's really produced a lot of CFLers the last couple of years here. But ultimately, I have a lot of questions about this quarterback room, because if Bethel Thompson is not the guy, if he's clearly not the guy this season, who do you turn to? And then looking at the running back position, which is going to come in at second in the CFL, and this is just giving a lot of the benefit of the doubt to Andrew Harris, who has long been arguably the league's top running back. And even though he had some struggles last year, he missed a lot of time due to injury, when he was on the field, he looked still at the top of his game, still in his mid-30s. I just think that is still going to carry over. I don't know how much of that elite top-level production we're going to see just because of how great the surrounding situation was in Winnipeg with that offensive line. But I definitely do think that a lot of that was Andrew Harris and his running style, be able to break tackles and be just an all-around threat from the running back position. And I'm just really excited to see what he can bring to this Toronto offense. They get rid of DJ Foster here, who was last year's starting running back, and that was a very interesting move. Obviously, ratio considerations here with Harris coming in, and it means that they're all in on Harris being the focal point of this offense this season. One thing I'll say about Harris, he wasn't as impactful as a receiver last year, and maybe that was due to injuries, maybe it was because of Winnipeg's offense changing a little bit under Buck Pierce, the offensive coordinator, but ultimately, it just wasn't a big part of his game last year, and we'll see if that returns here in 2022. And then behind him, you have AJ Ouellette, who's more of a physical runner. He has been with the Argos the past 2 seasons with a healthy 5.6 yards per carry on 46 career attempts so far. I think I've seen enough from him to be a capable backup if they ever decide to start an American in the backfield at any point this season. And then Declan Cross, who's more of a fullback type that is both a standout special teamer and a team leader. He can step in and block in the backfield and also has good enough hands to use as a receiver out of the backfield. Just a really good veteran player who's one of the longest tenured players on this team. I believe one of the few remaining from the 2017 Grey Cup. And then Dion Pellerin, a 2020 draft pick that played mainly a special teams role in his rookie season. And then Asenel Roble, a global player that has played in 15 games in his career but has never really received a touch in terms of the offensive side of the ball. And we'll see if he factors in at all this year. Now let's talk about the rookies in the running back room, starting with Daniel Adeboboye, the team's second-round pick out of Bryant University in this year's draft. He was the first running back taken in this year's draft, and what really impressed me was just his pro readiness in terms of pass blocking and picking up the blitz. That's what's really going to help him get onto the field early on in his career. And then Javon Leake, a 6-foot runner from the University of Maryland, where he was also a great kick returner, so watch out for that. Then Chase Arsenault, a late-round fullback type with some movement skills, who was selected in this year's CFL draft out of McMaster. And then finally Joe Carbone, who's a 6'4", 240-pound fullback type who played for the Windsor Lancers in U Sports. Overall, watch out for Leake and Adeboboye. Leake played a big role in the preseason game the other day that I watched, so keep an eye on those guys. Now looking at this impressive wide receiver core, which is going to come in at second in the CFL, and I just really like how much experience and diversity of skill sets. I say that all the time, but diversity of skill sets is so important in the wide receiver room in the CFL. And let's start talking about these guys, starting with Eric Rogers, who's a star possession receiver who specializes in tough, contested catches over the middle of the field. Rogers is one of the league's top red zone threats, as he often uses his size to his advantage in winning matchups. He struggled with injuries last season, but he was the team's top receiver when healthy. And then they bring in Brandon Banks, former most outstanding player from the Hamilton Tiger Cats, sacrilegious. I'm a Tiger Cats fan, that he's going to be seen playing for the Argos, but I think this is a pretty solid addition, but he did struggle last year, and you have to wonder about, he's an older player who's a smaller athlete. If you lose a little bit of that speed, does he just completely fall off? And did we see the best of Brandon Banks, or have we seen the best of Brandon Banks already? But I think when he's at his best, he's obviously a dynamic player that was starting to put it together a little bit more towards the end of last season. He played a big role in the team's Grey Cup run. I think there's still potential for a bounce back. I definitely don't see him playing as bad as he did last year at times for the Tiger Cats. So, I think it's an interesting signing here, and I think there's a decent chance of it really working out for the Argos and them really striking gold, and you really get an edge in that rivalry with Hamilton as well. So really excited to see how Banks plays with the Argos next season. And then Devaris Daniels, a boundary side perimeter receiver that has a good all-around skill set. Daniels has always had all the capabilities to be one of the league's best at the position, but for whatever reason, he has stretches where he disappears on the field and he just doesn't put up a lot of production. But then he can have amazing games, and it's just weird. He made one of the best catches of all last season against Hamilton in one of those 10 games that they played against each other last year. He's just an incredibly impressive receiver when he's playing at his best, but again, that inconsistency element shows up a little bit with him, but still an excellent weapon for this offense. And then you have Canadian Curly Gittens Jr., a 2021 breakout star who has good speed and crafty route running. Gittens ultimately, I think, has the ability to potentially become the best Canadian wide receiver in this league, and I think he's arguably already in that conversation with what he did last season. But I think he's even a candidate to have an even bigger 2022 than he had in 2021, just because I think he's just still growing into that role as a starter. That was really his first true year as a starter in the CFL, so really excited to see what he can do, and I just really like his potential going forward. And then Jawan Brescison, another Canadian here, who's an impact player when he's actually on the field, but he is also one of the most snake-bitten players in the entire league when it comes to injuries. It's just really unfortunate because Brescison can make a lot of big plays, and honestly, if he was healthy enough, you could argue he is one of the best Canadian receivers in the league, or one of the better slot backs in the league, but it's just the injury issues. You just never know if he can stay healthy. He's just been so snake-bitten in that regard. So I'm really interested to see if he can stay healthy this season. But that is quite a Canadian combo at receiver if you have both of those guys healthy. And then Dejon Brissett, who is the second overall pick from the 2020 CFL draft, who saw a decent bit of playing time on offense in his rookie season. And ultimately, Brissett really protects them in the event of another Brescison season-ending injury or, nagging injury. So I'm excited to see if he gets an opportunity, a bigger role this season for the Argos. I really like his potential, and he was a good special teams player as well in year one. And then Markeith Amble's a very interesting free agent signing, which I just don't understand why the Argos really brought him in here, because I don't even know if he's really going to play too big of a role with how many receivers they have here. But he's a very talented but inconsistent receiver that has made big plays but also costly mistakes like drops and offsides the last couple of years in Calgary. So I really don't know what to expect from him, but ultimately he's a talented player, and you never can have enough of those in your training camp. I just don't know where he makes an impact on this team. And then Chandler Worthy, who's a slot receiver that also contributes as a return man. And then Damien Jean-Pierre, who started 6 games for the Argos last season and made some impressive plays, including a touchdown, but not much else to say other than that. He just needs to get a longer run of playing time. And then Drez Anderson, who contributed down the stretch last season with 8 receptions. Anderson's dad is Willie Flipper Anderson, who still holds the record for most receiving yards in a single NFL game with 336. So, interesting connection to the NFL there. And then Cam Phillips, a former XFL star with the Houston Roughnecks, who was originally cut by Hamilton in training camp last season before joining Toronto. Phillips only dressed for 1 game last season and caught 2 passes, so we'll have to see if he can make an impact in year 2. And then Ernest Edwards, who showed some flashes in Edmonton last season, including a big showing in the Labor Day game versus Calgary. That's about the extent of his major impact he had over there. And then finally, Tommy Neal, a McMaster product that played 8 games in his rookie season, mostly on special teams. But overall, I just think this is one of the most deep receiving cores, probably the deepest receiving core in the entire league. And it has Canadian elements as well, helps them with ratio flexibility. And you have that elite talent as well with Eric Rogers and Brandon Banks if he can get back to that elite level. Now taking a look at their wide receiver rookies, starting with Sam Baker, who is the team's 6th round pick out of Saskatchewan in 2020, who signed with the team this offseason. So he's another guy that returned to school last year. And then DeMonte Coxey, a former star at the University of Memphis. Jamari Hester, a 6'6" target out of Jacksonville State. And then AJ Richardson, who played his college football at Boise State. Darius Robertson, who is a Michigan native who attended Wayne State University in Detroit. And then finally, Isaiah Wright, who was an undrafted guy in the NFL and saw a decent chunk of playing time in 2020 with Washington before coming to the CFL. So a couple of notable names there, but we'll see if any of them make an impact in a very deep wide receiver room like I just mentioned. Now looking at the offensive line, which is going to come in at 3rd in the CFL, and I think there's similar to the wide receiver room, they just have so much depth here, and I don't know exactly who is going to start, except for a few spots that I think are set in stone, but I just think there's just so many good veterans here that are going to compete and make this unit one of the best in the CFL. So starting with Peter Nicastro, who's a second-year player who already looked like a stud on the interior in his rookie season. Nicastro flashed both excellent pass blocking consistency and showed signs of being a plus run blocker. He also showcased positional versatility, starting games at left guard and then moving to center after an injury to Philip Blake earlier in the season, and then eventually just stayed there at center where he just excelled. And he ultimately was the East Division nominee for most outstanding rookie in the CFL last season. Very impressive ultimately. And then Darius Bladek, a veteran guard that is a better run blocker than a pass blocker, I would say. Bladek was a guy that didn't really impress me too much in terms of his pass protection in 2021. He had a lot of games where he was consistently getting beat from that right guard position. So we'll have to see how he does this season. If he continues to struggle in that respect, it wouldn't surprise me if he's ultimately replaced by one of these up-and-comers here. So going to be really interesting to see how he does this year. And then Philip Blake, who's a very solid lineman with versatility when healthy, but he's consistently struggled with injuries throughout his pro career. 2021 was one of his healthiest campaigns though, playing in 11 out of 14 games in the regular season. He's getting up there in age now at 36, and it's fair to wonder if he'll get pushed for his starting position in camp, but ultimately I think is actually one of the better run blockers in the entire CFL when he's healthy. And then Justin Lawrence, a free agent signing from Calgary that has developed largely as a rotational lineman the first few seasons of his career and will be looking for a bigger role here in Toronto. He's been relatively consistent in his appearances when he's gotten the opportunity to start, but he has not really got that extended look that could make you feel comfortable from a sample size perspective. So we'll have to see how he does this season and if he can win one of the starting roles on this offensive line. And then Shane Richards, a former first overall pick in 2019, he will look to put it all together in year 3. Though he did not begin the season as a starter, he ended up starting several games in 2021, and there was noticeable improvement as the season went along. However, Richards does have the tendency to get sloppy in his pass protection technique and get beat pretty badly on occasion, so we'll have to see how that plays out and if he can continue to refine that consistency aspect of his game. And then Dejon Allen, one of the most pleasant surprises when watching games from 2021 for me. He played the role of left tackle extremely well in 13 regular season starts. By the eye test, he was one of the better performing tackles last season, playing with high-level physical talent while showcasing some awareness in terms of how he was taking on some of the league's better edge rushers. Just a guy I'm very high on going into this season. And then Isaiah Cage, who started a handful of games at tackle in 2019, but was injured and missed the entire 2021 season. He will likely try to compete with Allen to reclaim his starting spot at left tackle, Potentially, he could start on the right side as well, where there could be a training camp competition. We'll talk about more of that in a bit, but it won't be easy for him to reclaim a starting spot on this very deep offensive line. And then Trayvon Tate, who started the season as Hamilton's starting left tackle, and he struggled mightily and ultimately was cut after just a few appearances for Hamilton. Tate later landed with the Argos, where he would start a few games at the tail end of last season. 2021 was Tate's first taste of CFL action, so I wouldn't be shocked if he sticks around here given his physical talent. And then Dylan Giffen, a 2020 draft pick out of Western that has great size and even saw some action at guard his rookie season. And then Jonathan Zamora, who was signed off of Calgary's practice roster late last season and appeared in 2 games for the Argos, including 1 start. So we'll see if he factors in at all this year. And then Martez Ivey, who was a pickup midway through 2021 and actually ended up starting at right tackle in the East Final versus Hamilton. He really struggled in that game, but ultimately the sample size is just too small to really make any judgments at this point. And so ultimately, you have a lot of guys here that have been in CFL games and started CFL games, and I think that you're ultimately going to have a lot of training camp competitions for these spots, and ultimately, I think you're going to find a very good 5-man unit out of this group. Adding to this offensive line room are the rookies, starting with Gregor McKellar, the team's first-round pick, 6th overall out of St. FX in this year's draft. Prior to coming to Atlantic Canada to play for St. FX, he actually played at Rice, so very interested to see. He has an NCAA pedigree. He went a little bit earlier than I expected in the CFL draft. I definitely didn't think he was going to be the second offensive lineman off the board. So very interested to see how he does this season. And then Braden Null, who is another pick from this year, who was taken in the mid-rounds out of Wilfrid Laurier, and might be more of a tackle in the CFL long term. That's what I've heard from guys like Marshall Ferguson that have seen him play on a regular basis. And then Motaba Metri, who is an undrafted prospect out of the University of Toronto. We'll see if he makes an impact as an unsung guy there. And then Jake Foshee, who is a native of Alaska, who played at Oklahoma Baptist University, another school I haven't heard of. Then Otavia Amorim, who is a former 3rd-round pick in the global draft out of Brazil. And then finally, Kofi Apaya, a former Villanova Wildcat who was a consistent starter while in college. Overall, not expecting any of these guys really to make a huge impact this year, just given how much depth they have from a veteran perspective on that offensive line. Now let's take a look at the defensive side of the ball, starting with the defensive line, which is going to come in at 3rd in the CFL. And this defensive line made one huge addition this offseason that makes it just single-handedly a much more scary defensive line and much more scary defense, and that is Ja'Gared Davis, who's one of the most impactful defenders in the CFL. He has the ability to get hot for multiple game stretches like he did towards the end of 2021. I think he had like 5 sacks in 3 playoff games for Hamilton. He was just all over the place, and you don't have to tell Argos fans that too, because in the East Final, he was wrecking havoc all over the field and was one of the main reasons why Hamilton was able to ultimately win that game. But he's now on the Argos side, which is going to be such a big component for this defense, and I'm really, really excited to see what he adds to this team as one of the top pass rushers in this game. Last season, that edge presence for the Argos sometimes was lacking a little bit, and this is really going to solidify it, and then some. And then Sean Oakman, an ultra-lengthy defensive tackle with tremendous pass rush upside. Oakman was extremely impactful for the Argos in his rookie season. Oakman most often wins with quickness, but also showed off a nice bull rush at times. He also was a better run defender than I thought he'd be when I was reviewing the film, and he definitely was not the reason why the Argos had ultimately a pretty poor run defense all of last season. So ultimately, I think Oakman is one of the highest upside defensive linemen in the league, and I think with Davis by his side, he's only going to get even better. And then behind those 2 superstars, you have Coney Ely, an interior defensive lineman at the CFL level that started 2021 as one of this team's starters, but struggled with injuries most of the season and didn't really play in a lot of games. He had a breakout of sorts in the East Final versus Hamilton where he had 2 sacks. He's older for a second-year player at 30 years old, having spent time in other professional football avenues such as the NFL, playing in the Super Bowl. A lot of pro experience for Coney Ely that he brings to the table. I think he was very effective in the short time that I saw him on a CFL field last season. And then Shane Ray, a former first-round pick in the NFL draft by the Denver Broncos that won the starting defensive end job out of training camp last year. Ray was injured much of the season, but when he was on the field, I didn't feel like he made his impact felt all too much. However, some CFL players make a jump in year 2, and we'll have to see if that happens with him. And then Canadian Robbie Smith, who's an edge rusher that mostly contributed on a rotational basis last season. Smith has often generated pressure in those opportunities so far in his career, and in my opinion, he's a guy that I would feel comfortable starting at defensive end for Toronto if they really needed to. And then Adrian Tracy, a veteran pass rusher that didn't play in 2021 after a brief retirement, but has totaled 21 career sacks. He heads to Toronto after playing his entire career previously with Hamilton. Fabian Foote, an interior defensive lineman, a Canadian guy too, that can be used as a spot starter and special teams contributor, but I wouldn't expect much more from him. And then Sam Achimpong, a second-year player that showed signs of being an extremely formidable run defender last year, and also produced 2 sacks last year as a rookie, and I think he was a guy that, if he can get a little bit more of an opportunity, he could be a very solid player in this league. And then Dwayne Hendricks, who started a handful of games in his first year in the CFL and wasn't particularly noticeable other than a few flashes in run defense. So we'll see if he can continue to grow. And then towards the bottom here, Benoit Marion, a former third-round pick by the Alouettes, who got some playing time in the defensive line rotation at the end of last year with the Argos. And then finally, Eli Menser, who played in 6 games in his CFL debut season and managed 1 interception already. So pretty impressive there. So ultimately, these 2 superstars at the top of this unit is really what's going to carry this unit all season long. And I think if you can get one of Ely and Ray to really pop and really establish themselves as plus starters in the CFL, this is going to be a scary defensive line this season. Now, they also bring plenty of defensive line rookies to camp here, starting with Deontay Knight, who is the team's second-round pick in the 22 CFL draft out of Western, and was a guy that was talked about early on in the draft process as potentially going first overall. And I'm excited to see how he does here in Toronto in a position that they don't necessarily have a ton of great Canadian players in this unit. And then Jake Halava, a 250-pound defensive lineman from Grand Valley State, same school that Brandon Revenberg of the Hamilton Tiger Cats went to. Connor Flagel, who spent training camp last year with Ottawa and played college football for Central Missouri. Kendall Futrell, who's a defensive end out of East Carolina. And then Julian McLeod, who's one of a number of CFL players that are from Wagner College, which I don't even know where that is, but several players in the CFL are from there. So interesting that another guy's coming out of there. And then Simeon Akanta-Wariso, a native of UK who was a second-round pick in the global draft. We'll see if he makes an impact as one of their globals. Michael Pizzuto, a defensive lineman that fits more of the defensive tackle mold at 270 pounds. He was the team's 8th-round pick in May's draft. Jacki Polite, a former 3rd-round pick in the NFL draft, who looks to revamp his pro career in the CFL as a rookie. He famously was drafted by the New York Jets in that 3rd round and then didn't even end up playing a game for the team. He was actually cut in his first training camp, so he was seen as a major bust in the NFL. We'll see if he makes an impact here in the CFL. And then finally, Alani Patutau, a standout from Adams State University who previously spent time with the Atlanta Falcons. So overall, I'm very interested to see how all of these guys factor in this season. Now moving on to the linebacker room, which is going to come in at 5th in the CFL, and I think you have a very solid group, and this is no slight to them. I think there's just a lot of good linebacking groups right now in the CFL. Of course, this unit is still led by Henoc Muamba, who is still one of the handful or so most impactful linebackers in the entire CFL. What I would say really sticks out to me about Muamba's game is his elite pursuit speed and just being able to make up crazy angles running sideline to sideline. He isn't as instinctive in zone coverage as the top coverage linebackers in the league, but his physical gifts allow him to close quickly and make impact plays on a very regular basis. And I think it was that game back it was the last regular season game between Toronto and Hamilton last year. This guy was all over the field, and he was one of the biggest difference makers, and I'm just so excited to watch him yet again this season. It's just been a pleasure to watch his career. And then Wynton McManus, who comes back to the CFL after last playing north of the border in 2019, where he had a productive season at linebacker and on special teams. He spent some time in the NFL in 2021 with New Orleans and Miami. He likely figures in as this team's starting weak side linebacker alongside Muamba, and I'm excited to see how he reintroduces himself into the CFL. He was pretty good back in 2019 with Calgary, obviously enough to earn some opportunities in the NFL. He was a good special teams player as well, if I remember correctly, so interested to see how he transitions to the Argos this season. And then Chris Edwards, the strong side linebacker, who is a very versatile athlete. He was arguably this team's best defensive player in 2021. Edwards just made countless plays in coverage or while coming off the blitz last year. He was just an overall playmaker for this defense. But the only thing that's hanging over him at this point is a pending suspension from last year, resulting from the end of the East Final where he got into a fight with a fan. So we'll see what happens with that, but he's an excellent player that the team brings back here. And then Trevor Hoyt, a 4th round pick in 2021 out of Carleton, who made an impact in his rookie season, appearing in all 14 games and recording 20 tackles. He's a good depth piece to have behind Muamba, and it's good that he got his feet wet with a couple of starts last year. And then Jack Cassar, who was the team's 2nd round pick in 2020 out of Carleton, that interestingly enough, he was the roommate of Hoyt's at Carleton, so interesting connection there with those two guys. And then Brandon Calver, a 3-year CFL vet with no career defensive tackles, just a special teams guy. And then finally Brady Sheldon, who dressed for his only career CFL game in 2021 in the season finale, so we'll see if he can make an impact on this team. So overall, just one of the better linebacking groups in the entire CFL. Even though it ranks right in the middle, I really think it's a really good unit. You have an impact Canadian starter there. You have a really good strong side linebacker. Wynton McManus, I don't think he was one of the best linebackers in the CFL in 2019, but I think he's going to be a good starter for this defense and enough to have them at 5th in the CFL. Now let's look at the rookies in the linebacking core, starting with Enoch Penny-Larea, the 3rd round pick from this team out of McMaster, who will likely be a special teams demon at the CFL level due to his well-rounded physical profile. This guy had absurd measurables at this year's combine, so very excited to see what he can do. And then Daniel Kwamu, who was a 5th round pick out of UBC in this year's draft. Quite a few guys from UBC being taken in this year's draft. And then Jonathan Jones, an undersized linebacker at 5'11", who played at the University of Toledo. Tony Jones, a former Texas Tech Red Raider who has a professional background in the indoor football league. Always interesting to see guys come from there and transition to playing up here. And then finally Solomon Ajayi, who played college football at Liberty and is the brother of former NFL running back Jay Ajayi. Now let's take a look at the Argos defensive back room, which is going to come in at 6th in the CFL. And I think there's plenty of guys that can play in this unit and have shown a good amount of potential at the CFL level. I don't think there's really a superstar in this unit yet. I think there could be, and let's talk about them right now. So we'll start with Deshaun Amos, a boundary halfback who had impressive stretches of play in 2019 and in 2021. He is a physical player that, when at his best, can match up with some of the best receivers in the league, and he's a guy that just never quits on the play. And one of my favorite plays from all of last season was actually in one of the first games, Calgary versus Toronto. Ricky Collins, wide receiver for Toronto, so fast, and he just has a clear touchdown. And Deshaun Amos could have just given up on the play. He chases him down, punches the ball out, and Calgary's able to recover the ball. So very impressive play that was. One of my favorite plays from last season, and really epitomizes what Amos is as a player. And I just think he's probably this unit's best defensive back going into this season. And then Jamal Peters, a bigger, longer boundary corner that made his fair share of mistakes in his rookie season, but also had moments where he showed a lot of promise. Peters is a very physical defensive back that can, when he's on his game, match up physically with some of the bigger receivers in the league, such as a Eugene Lewis. So that is a very important player if he can continue to develop, matching up with Montreal and those two huge superstar receivers that they have in Winicky and Lewis, this is the type of guy that you can use in coverage against those type of players. So I really like Jamal Peterson's potential, but we'll have to see if he can put it together on a consistent basis. Like I said, there were some very down moments last year as well. And then Shaq Richardson, who's a versatile veteran that loves to be aggressive and jump routes, which have resulted in both positive and negative results for the Argos the last few seasons. He's also a guy that can play a little bit of strong side linebacker as well, so he's a candidate to start there as well. So he's a very versatile veteran that you like having in the room. And then Jalen Collins, another long and physical corner that impressed towards the end of last season. Collins was able to generate 2 interceptions in 5 starts, and likely figures in as this team's field corner this season. It's going to be a competition amongst a lot of guys in this defensive back room that I've listed here, but I think Collins showed a lot at the end of last year and, was a very impressive guy. He's another guy that was a former NFL player that actually ended up starting in the Super Bowl back a few years ago for the Atlanta Falcons versus New England. And then Robertson Daniel, who's mostly been a corner at the CFL level, but did not see much action in 2021, only dressing for 2 games, so we'll see if he plays a bigger role with the Argos this season. And then Tristan Deku, who started several games in 2021 and had moments, but gave up a lot of crucial catches in big spots in games. And then Royce Metchie, who comes over from Calgary in the Cameron Judge trade, but likely will be still recovering from a previous injury to start the 2022 season. And he has really established himself over the past few seasons as a solid starter at the safety position. And he has really good coverage range, not too much of a physical safety for you, but he's going to be a guy that's going to cover a lot of grass, really be a good free safety back there. And then Matt Boateng, a former second-round pick from 2019 that has played mostly a depth role the past few seasons, including 4 starts. Josh Haggerty, a 6th-round pick out of Saskatchewan in 2021 that is already trending towards being a steal. What's telling was that he was already a rotational guy in year 1 and appeared in all 14 regular season games. Actually saw some time on defense, so exciting for his potential going forward with this unit. And then Tiki Sanko, a global player from Sierra Leone that came through the NFL's International Player Program originally, and eventually entered his name into the CFL Global Draft, where the Argos took him 3rd overall in the 1st round. And then these last 2 guys haven't really seen too much action over the past 2 years, starting with Maurice Carnell, who appeared in 1 game for Hamilton back in 2019, but has bounced around since. And then finally, Robert Priester, who played in a few games with Winnipeg back in 2018, but was cut last year by the Elks in training camp. So overall, I don't think there's necessarily a superstar in this unit. That's probably why it gets dragged down overall in this ranking, but I do think there's a good amount of depth here, a good amount of guys that have played a significant amount of snaps in secondaries around the CFL, and I think ultimately it's a unit that you're comfortable with. Now let's take a look at their defensive back rookies, starting with Dion Harris, who's another CFLer that comes out of the University of North Dakota. Several players that have come out of there in recent years, so very interesting there. Then Caleb Holden, who is from little-known Merrimack University, never heard of it. Then Eric Sutton, who is a late-round pick in this year's CFL draft out of Texas State. D'Angelo Amos, who is the brother of Deshaun, and he played his college football with the Virginia Cavaliers. Cam Glenn, a bigger defensive back from Wake Forest. And then Tavarius McFadden, who was a former XFLer with the Tampa Bay Vipers that was with the Argos last year but didn't appear in any games. And then finally, James Sample, who was a former 3rd-round pick in the NFL draft, and he actually saw a lot of action in the NFL as well, I believe most notably with Jacksonville, but he was signed with the team last year and ultimately did not play in any games. So very interesting group of defensive back rookies. We'll see if any of these guys play a factor this year. Now looking at our final positional rankings with special teams, which is going to come in at 4th in the CFL. And the value with this unit is that Boris Bede does both the kicking and punting jobs at a very satisfying level. Very much a power-based kicker that he for sure has the strongest leg in the CFL. But he does give up some accuracy from time to time, so you trade that off, but ultimately he was very consistent last year, and I was very happy with his performance. And then I really like Chandler Worthy as a kick returner. There's other guys in this roster that could fill that role, but I think he did a very good job of that last season and provides a lot of value in that sense. So you average all those rankings out, and this is what you get. The Argos finished 4th in offense in my rankings and 5th on defense. Very well-balanced roster, very talented roster. Would have ranked even higher on offense if not for the quarterback position, which I obviously have questions about. But I think defensively they have a lot of talent as well. Just a very well-balanced roster that can compete for a Grey Cup this season. Now let's take a look at the projected starting lineups I put together for this team, starting with the offense. And to start off, I will talk about the offensive line first of all, and those guard positions with Philip Blake and Darius Bladek, two veteran guys that I think with younger guys here, with Justin Lawrence, for example, and Shane Richards, you could see those younger guys have a youth movement here and ultimately take over those starting spots. So keep an eye on that. Martez Ivey I have projected as that starting right tackle, but that could easily be Isaiah Cage, who is a guy that was coming back from injury last season. And then in the receiving core, the only question is really Jawan Brescacin, the Canadian receiver. Does he get beaten out by a guy like Dejon Brissett because of injuries that Brescacin has had in the past? Brescacin is no doubt a very talented player, but just the injury concerns are what would make me question that. And then I underlined Brandon Banks as well, just because of the sheer amount of depth in the receiving core. I think if one of those other guys has a really strong camp, you could see Banks on the verge of being kicked out of this starting lineup just because he's a bit of an older player, and I really don't see any of the other guys really getting kicked out of this unit. So ultimately, I think that's how the Argos are going to line up on offense. Now let's take a look on defense. So looking at the defensive line, I have a couple of questions there with Shane Ray and Coney Ely, the two guys that started at the beginning of last season. Do they retain their starting jobs? Obviously, Ja'Garrett Davis and Sean Oakman are going to start there. The linebacking core, I'm very comfortable. Those are going to be your three guys there. But in the secondary, Royce Mechie, that's more of a ratio question. Are they going to start a Canadian in this defensive backroom, or are they going to go All-American? And then Jamal Peters, a guy that I think has a lot of potential, but we'll have to see if he can continue to show some consistency and beat out a lot of veterans that they're bringing to camp. Now let's take a look at my team award predictions, starting with most outstanding player, and I'm going with running back Andrew Harris, who I think is going to be the bell cow for this offense, and they're really going to ride him all season long. Really wanted to become more of a physical team on offense, I think, with a lot of their draft selections the last couple of years, and obviously the addition of Harris here is going to give them a new identity on that side of the ball. They didn't really run the ball too effectively all of last season, so we'll see if he can really improve that running game, and I think he's going to have an excellent season this year. And then most outstanding defensive player, I'm going with Sean Oakman. Is a guy that was really good last year. He was great last year, but I don't think people were really paying attention to it, and I think he's going to really announce himself on the scene this year as one of the best defensive linemen in all of the CFL and win this nomination. And then most outstanding Canadian, also going to go with Andrew Harris, obviously, because of winning the most outstanding player. Why wouldn't you win most outstanding Canadian? And then most outstanding offensive lineman, I'm going with Peter Nicastro, who I think is going to be the guy that you know is going to be there from day one for this unit. Just really excited to see if he can continue that success that he had when he was named East Division Rookie of the Year last season. Now finally, let's go on to our key question, which is, can McLeod Bethel Thompson play at a consistent level for an entire season? We've seen stretches for like 2 or 3 games where he can play very well, but we've also seen stretches of bad play from McLeod Bethel Thompson. Can he level it out and play very well for an entire CFL season? I'm not too sure he's a guy that can play 2 or 3 consistent good games in a row and win you a Grey Cup, but I do think he has the physical tools, and like I said earlier, I do think he arguably has the strongest arm in the entire CFL. He just needs to find a way to kind of hone it in, hit those deep balls a little bit more. And one thing that is important to remember about him is that this is his first season that he's going to be the starting quarterback going into training camp. So very excited to see what he can do with that full training camp opportunity as the number 1 guy. But again, skeptical about his chances of doing so. very excited to see how it plays out this year. And with that said, that is going to be the end of today's roster review, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to thank each and every one of you for watching. Once again, my name is Jason. If you want to support the channel, the best way to do it is by hitting the like button and subscribing to Ozzy's Huddle for more CFL content just like this. I really appreciate it, everybody. And be sure to let me know in the comment section what you think of the 2022 Toronto Argonauts. Are they going to have a season again like they had last year, or are they going to be a team that craters back to the bottom of the standings? So be sure to let me know in the comment section what you think about this team going into this year. And with that said, I hope everyone has a great day, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.